New York was not ruled by one government. It had two. One sat in City Hall. The other sat in back rooms, smoke-filled restaurants, union offices, waterfront bars, and silent cars parked under dead street lamps. During Prohibition, the city learned to drink in secret. And while America preached morality, men like Lucky Luciano, Dutch Schultz, Louis Le Buhalter, and Albert Anastasia learned something far more valuable. If you controlled fear, vice, and loyalty, you did not need to own the city on paper. You could own it in reality. This is the real story of how New York's Mafia built an empire. The first thing to understand about old New York is this: the law was never the only power in town. On paper, the city belonged to elected officials, judges, police captains, reformers, and newspaper editors. In practice, power moved through side doors. It moved through bartenders who remembered faces, union men who controlled who worked, ward bosses who traded favors, detectives who looked away, and gangsters who learned that fear could be organized just as easily as any corporation. The city did not wake up one morning and decide to belong to the underworld. It happened slowly. A payoff here, a protection agreement there, a missing witness, a judge who suddenly saw things differently, a warehouse that somehow never got raided, a truck route that always stayed open. New York was too large to control honestly and too rich to leave untouched. Every neighborhood had its own economy, and every economy had a vulnerable point: a dock, a bar, a club, a market, a numbers operation, a delivery line, a warehouse, a labor hall. The men who learned how to touch those pressure points became more than criminals. They became unofficial administrators of the city's dark machinery. That was the genius of organized crime in New York. It did not just steal from the city. It learned how the city functioned, then inserted itself into the gears. When Prohibition arrived, it did something almost perfect for organized crime. It criminalized a desire that millions of ordinary people still had. The public did not stop drinking. It simply stopped drinking legally. That one political decision created a gold mine for anyone ruthless enough to supply the market. Speakeasies spread across the city. Illegal breweries worked in back lots and hidden basements. Trucks moved at night. Policemen were bribed. Competitors were threatened. Accounts were kept in cash. Suddenly, the men who could deliver alcohol reliably were not street punks anymore. They were businessmen in dark suits, because the volume of money became too large for chaos. This was the moment New York's underworld began to industrialize. Small-time gangs could still mug, extort, or run corners, but the real future belonged to men who understood systems: supply, distribution, protection, territory, political insulation, violence used carefully, not wastefully. The city's appetite for vice was not a weakness to them. It was an engine. And once that engine started, it fed everyone willing to serve it: smugglers, warehouse owners, corrupt cops, crooked accountants, union fixers, waiters, nightclub managers, and the bosses above them all. That is why old New York felt like a city with two governments. One government made speeches, the other settled disputes. One government passed laws. The other decided when those laws would matter. One government collected taxes. The other collected tribute. The legal city had paperwork. The illegal city had leverage. And by the middle of the 1920s, that illegal city was no longer ruled by random gangs. It was being shaped by ambitious men who wanted permanence. Men who did not just want money for tonight. Men who wanted an empire that could survive elections, raids, and funerals. Among those men, one stood apart. He had the instincts of a street criminal, but the mind of an organizer. He could speak to old-world Sicilians, Jewish syndicate partners, bootleggers, gamblers, politicians, and killers. He understood that the future of crime in New York would not belong to the loudest man in the room. It would belong to the man who could turn violence into structure. Before the city knew his name, he was already learning its weak spots. Before the city feared Lucky Luciano, it had already taught him exactly how power worked. New York was not conquered in one night. It was absorbed deal by deal. Before he became Lucky Luciano, before the expensive suits, the bodyguards, the boardroom tables, and the headlines, he was Salvatore Lucania, a hard boy raised in one of the roughest environments New York could offer. The Lower East Side was not a place that produced innocence for long. It produced survivors. It taught children how money moved, how pride could get you hurt, how weakness was noticed immediately, and how neighborhoods became kingdoms for whoever could dominate them. The immigrant blocks were packed tight with ambition, exhaustion, and hunger. Men worked brutal hours. Women held families together by force of will. Children learned the street because the street was always there, waiting. For a boy like Lucania, the path toward crime was not romantic. It was practical. Respect mattered. Protection mattered. Money mattered. The ability to command other boys mattered. He learned quickly that intimidation could be monetized. Threats could be monetized. Friendship, too, if it linked him to the right people. That was one of the earliest signs of what made him different. He did not think in narrow ethnic boxes forever. He learned to form alliances where profit lived. That talent would become the foundation of his rise. The old neighborhood order had its own unwritten rules. You stayed close to your own people. You respected older bosses. You paid tribute upward. You fought over corners and collections. But New York itself was already bigger than those rules. Jewish gangsters, Irish crews, Italian operators, labor racketeers, nightclub owners, smugglers, all of them were touching the same city, the same markets, the same opportunities. Luciano's instincts pushed him toward that larger map. He saw early that loyalty was valuable, but loyalty without expansion was a cage. That is one reason his partnerships mattered so much. Men like Frank Koslow and Meyer Lansky represented something new, a more flexible criminal world, built on business before tradition. Luciano did not abandon his roots. He weaponized them. He could still speak the language of old Sicily when he needed to. But he also understood modernity. He understood urban America. He understood that crime was moving away from isolated neighborhood bosses and toward networks. That mental shift is what separates a capable gangster from a future architect of an empire. Plenty of men in New York were violent. Plenty were greedy. Plenty were fearless. Luciano was dangerous because he was strategic. He seemed to understand, even before his power fully formed, that the city itself was a machine waiting to be read. The gangsters who stayed local would always remain vulnerable. One arrest could break them. One stronger rival could absorb them. But the gangster who could connect neighborhoods, markets, and alliances would have something far harder to destroy. That ambition did not yet make him a king. It made him patient. He learned where to stand, who to flatter, who to threaten, and who to keep close. He learned how the young men at street level could be used as muscle, while the older men above them believed they were still in control. He learned how fear and charisma could travel together, and by the time Prohibition poured money into New York like fuel into a furnace, Luciano was no longer just another hard kid from the Lower East Side. He was exactly the kind of man that a suddenly criminalized city was about to reward. Luciano did not invent crime. He reorganized the men who practiced it. When the United States outlawed alcohol, it did not erase demand. It multiplied opportunity. That is one of the great paradoxes of American crime. Moral reform created a black market so large that only organized groups could dominate it. New York, with its docks, warehouses, nightlife, politicians, police precincts, and endless appetite, became the perfect laboratory. If you could move alcohol into this city, store it, protect it, distribute it, and keep your enemies from hijacking the route, you could make an ocean of money. The profits changed everything. Street gangs that once lived on small extortion schemes suddenly had access to industrial-scale cash flow. Bootlegging required logistics. Logistics required planning. Planning required discipline, accountants, enforcers, drivers, middlemen, union contacts, warehouse space, and legal cover. This is where the old romantic idea of the gangster begins to collapse. The successful bootlegger was not simply a man with a gun. He was part owner, part manager, part warlord, and every shipment that moved safely through the city made the underworld more professional. Speakeasies did more than sell drinks. They connected the underworld to respectable society. Politicians drank there. Bankers drank there. Reporters drank there. Cops drank there. The illegal bar became a social bridge between the lawful city and the unlawful one. That blurred line was priceless. It meant gangsters were no longer operating only in alleys or waterfront sheds. They were entering rooms where influence was exchanged. Protection became easier to buy because everyone wanted something from the same dark economy. Luciano rose inside that world because he understood scale. He was not alone, of course. No empire forms from one mind. But he belonged to a class of younger operators who recognized that Prohibition was not a temporary hustle. It was a revolution in criminal opportunity. This was the era in which he served under larger bosses, learned the practical mechanics of the trade, and began to see where the real weakness lay. The weakness was not supply. The weakness was governance. Too many bosses fought like old neighborhood kings while the money demanded a modern structure. Luciano saw that contradiction clearly. The more money entered bootlegging, the more impossible the old rules became. Territory now mattered beyond a block or district. Smuggling routes ran through boroughs. Partnerships crossed ethnic lines. Assassinations became economic decisions. Rivalries were no longer just personal insults. They were market corrections enforced by murder. This is the environment that shaped New York's future. It made old bosses richer, but it also made them obsolete. They were trying to govern a 1930s criminal economy with 1890s instincts. That tension produced the next phase of the city's underworld, the fight between the old order and the men who wanted something larger. Luciano was climbing, learning, calculating. Others were doing the same. The city did not yet know that a restructuring was coming. It only saw the violence, the headlines, the raids, the glamour, the blood. But beneath those public signals, a quieter process was taking place. A blueprint was being written, and when the moment arrived, the men who understood systems would move against the men who only understood rank. Every time the city changed the rules, the Mafia changed faster. Joe Masseria represented the power of the old order, heavy, proud, territorial, rooted in older Sicilian ideas of authority. Men like him had risen in a different environment, one where respect was vertical, obedience was expected, and criminal leadership rested on tradition as much as efficiency. For a time, that model still worked. Masseria had influence, muscle, and fear on his side. He also had ambitious younger men beneath him, Luciano among them, who understood both his strengths and his limits. Luciano did not become powerful by openly challenging Masseria from the start. That would have been suicide. Instead, he learned under him, profited under him, and studied the contradictions inside his rule. The city's criminal economy was becoming broader, faster, more interconnected. Yet the older bosses still thought in rigid hierarchies and inherited privilege. To younger men who had seen Prohibition transform vice into industry, that rigidity looked less like tradition and more like dead weight. Then came the attack that changed Luciano forever. In 1929, he was abducted, beaten savagely, and left for dead in what became known as a one-way ride. The message was unmistakable. In New York's underworld, suspicion alone could become a death sentence. A man did not need to be convicted of betrayal. He only needed to look useful to the wrong future. Luciano survived, but survival came at a price. The attack left visible marks and invisible conclusions. If he had ever still entertained illusions about loyalty inside the old system, they were gone now. That experience matters because it turned ambition into necessity. Before the one-way ride, Luciano was dangerous. After it, he became resolved. He had seen what the old order did to men it could not fully trust. He had learned that in a transitional era, waiting politely for promotion was another way of waiting to die. New York's underworld had entered a phase where hesitation was fatal. The men who adapted would live. The men who clung to inherited rank would eventually become targets. The one-way ride did more than harden Luciano. It clarified the future. He could no longer operate as if the world above him were stable. He could no longer assume older bosses would make room for younger vision. The criminal city was changing too fast. Prohibition had created money beyond imagination. Rivalries were sharpening. Alliances were shifting. Respect was still spoken aloud, but calculation was driving everything behind the scenes. In that kind of world, the survivor with a plan becomes more dangerous than the king with a throne. So Luciano did what the most important political animals in every era do. He concealed the full scale of his intentions until the moment was right. He kept learning, kept building ties, kept measuring rivals, kept waiting for the larger conflict to break open. And when it did, it would not merely decide who wore the crown in New York. It would decide what kind of empire the city's underworld would become. Someone tried to erase Luciano. Instead, they finished creating him. By 1930, the pressure inside New York's underworld had become too great to contain. The struggle between Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano escalated into what history remembers as the Castellammare War. To outsiders, it looked like another chapter of gangster bloodshed, another wave of headlines proving that criminals eventually kill one another. But inside the criminal economy, it was more significant than that. This was a civil war over the future structure of power. The old system was collapsing, and everyone could feel it. The war was expensive. It brought heat. It disrupted business. It turned the city's underworld into a field of suspicion. Men were shot in restaurants, on sidewalks, inside cars. Alliances shifted quickly because survival demanded flexibility. Luciano hated the chaos not because he was morally different, but because he understood what chaos cost. Disorder ruins profit. Endless vendetta invites police attention. A criminal empire can tolerate violence. It cannot tolerate randomness forever. For Luciano and other younger operators, the war confirmed something they had already suspected. The old bosses were trapped inside a dying political culture. They still wanted ultimate titles, inherited prestige, and rigid chains of obedience. But New York had become too large, too commercial, and too interconnected for that kind of rule to remain efficient. The city's dark economy needed arbitration, not endless feudal warfare. It needed structure, not mythology. Luciano did not dream of becoming just another old-world king. He wanted to replace kingship itself with management. That is the radical idea at the heart of his rise. Most gangsters imagine themselves at the top of the existing order. Luciano imagined a new order entirely. He could work with Jewish partners, Italian bosses, labor fixers, hitmen, and political intermediaries because he did not worship purity of tradition. He worshipped functionality. In a city governed by supply routes, protection systems, and massive cash flows, that made him modern. And in criminal history, modernity is often deadlier than pride. As the war intensified, the possibilities narrowed. Neutrality became difficult. Half measures became dangerous. Every important figure in New York's underworld had to ask the same question: which future will keep me alive? Luciano's answer was becoming clearer by the day. The war would not end simply because one boss defeated another. It would end only when the very logic of the old hierarchy was broken. That meant betrayal was coming. And in the criminal world, betrayal is often just strategy with the mask removed. The city above ground saw murders. The city below ground saw transition. That difference matters. A restaurant shooting might terrify the public, but inside the syndicate it could mean a contract, a correction, a transfer of leverage. The bloodshed of the Castellammare War was terrible, but it also served as the furnace in which a new system was forged. The only question left was who would make the final move first. New York stopped being a city of gangsters. It became a laboratory of power. The killing of Joe Mafia has become one of the central scenes in American criminal history because it captures the end of one world in a single image. A meal, a card game, a trusted lieutenant leaving the table, gunman entering, a boss dead in his chair. It was not just murder. It was an administrative decision wrapped in betrayal. Mafia had become an obstacle to the future, and obstacles in New York's underworld were not debated forever. They were removed. The elegance of the move lay in its message. Luciano was no longer acting like a subordinate inside an older structure. He was helping dismantle that structure itself. Whether one calls it betrayal, pragmatism, or inevitability, The result was the same. The boss who embodied the old order was gone. But what made Luciano especially ruthless was this: he did not intend to stop there. He was not helping one king defeat another so he could serve the winner. He was using the war to clear the board. There is a temptation to imagine these events purely in personal terms: ego, revenge, humiliation, ambition. Those things were real, but they are not enough to explain why Luciano mattered. Many gangsters have ambition, few redesign institutions. Maseria's death was the first open sign that the old architecture of Mafia leadership in New York could be taken apart, piece by piece. Once that truth became visible, the rest of the city's underworld had to recalibrate immediately. What loyalty meant after Maseria's death was no longer obvious. Was loyalty owed to bloodline, to ethnicity, to the title of boss? Or was loyalty now owed to the structure most likely to preserve business and prevent chaos? That question is where modern organized crime begins to separate from medieval criminal fealty. Luciano's answer was cold. The purpose of power is not ceremony, it is continuity. If a man at the top threatens continuity, he is expendable. Maseria's death should have settled the war in favor of the opposing camp. On paper, Salvatore Maranzano had won, but Luciano was already thinking beyond the victory conditions that other men recognized. He understood something Maranzano did not. Anyone who claimed supreme authority in the old style had become part of the problem. New York had become too vast for one boss of bosses, too commercial for inherited absolutes, too interconnected for ceremonial monarchy. The future belonged to a committee of predators, not a crowned patriarch. That is why the death in Coney Island was so important. It was not only a killing, it was the rehearsal for a larger transformation. Luciano had betrayed the man above him. Soon he would move against the man who believed he had inherited everything. Luciano's first great betrayal was not personal. It was structural. After Maseria's death, Salvatore Maranzano behaved like the war had restored the old world. He crowned himself supreme. He distributed rank. He acted as if New York had merely changed masters, not eras. That was his mistake. Maranzano understood triumph, but Luciano understood historical timing. The city no longer needed another ceremonial ruler trying to revive an outdated model. It needed a structure that could absorb conflict, protect profits, and reduce the need for constant civil war. Luciano saw the danger immediately. If Maranzano consolidated the old type of supremacy, then the entire bloody transition would have changed very little. Different face, same limitations, same ego, same future of inevitable conflict. So Luciano decided to do what almost no one at that level dares attempt twice in a single season: kill the winner too. The assassination of Maranzano was more than a second betrayal. It was a declaration of doctrine. No single man would be allowed to stand above the system in the old way again. Luciano's genius and his menace lay in recognizing that power can be made stronger by being diffused among competing interests rather than concentrated in one aging figure. That is where the commission enters the story, and with it the beginnings of what the public would later know as the Five Families. The commission was not a peace treaty in the moral sense. It was a management framework for predators. It created channels for arbitration, profit sharing, and strategic discipline. Instead of letting every insult trigger open warfare, it offered a structure for deciding which conflicts mattered and which could be settled through calculation. Luciano's real weapon was never just the gun. It was administration. This is the moment when New York's Mafia stops looking like scattered crime and starts looking like governance without legitimacy. The five families were not just names. They were durable containers of power inside the city. The commission was not just a meeting, it was a redesign of criminal politics. Luciano had helped kill the old order, but more importantly, he had offered something in its place, a flexible machine capable of surviving personalities. Of course, violence did not disappear. Violence remained the final language, but it became more systematized, more purposeful, more integrated into a broader architecture. That is why the 1930s matter so much. They are the decade in which organized crime in New York grows from a series of powerful men into a more resilient organism. And once an organism reaches that stage, taking down one boss no longer kills the body. The commission promised order. The city would eventually learn what enforced that promise. Not every king in New York's underworld wore an Italian name. Dutch Schultz, born Arthur Flegenheimer, rose out of the Bronx and built a fierce reputation through bootlegging, breweries, protection, and brute force. He was intelligent, volatile, wealthy, and dangerous in a way that made him hard to absorb fully into anyone else's machine. That made him important. New York's underworld was not a neat pyramid. It was an ecosystem of centers of power, and Schultz was one of the strongest among them. His rise illustrates another truth about the city. Organized crime in New York was never only about ethnicity. Ethnicity shaped loyalties and alliances, but money bent boundaries constantly. The city rewarded whoever could dominate a market. Schultz dominated several. He was the kind of man who could make enormous money and create enormous problems at the same time. What made Schultz compelling was that he represented both the opportunity and the instability of the era after Prohibition's early boom. Men like Luciano wanted disciplined systems. Men like Schultz embodied the risk that individual greed and aggression could destabilize those systems. He was powerful enough to command fear, rich enough to buy loyalty, and impulsive enough to endanger himself. In a criminal order trying to professionalize, that combination is combustible. Yet Schultz thrived because New York still rewarded ruthlessness. Numbers running, gambling, labor influence, extortion, territorial control, all of it remained fertile ground. Even as national attitudes changed and the repeal of Prohibition reconfigured the market, the underworld did not shrink. It diversified. That is the mistake casual observers often make. They imagine organized crime dying when alcohol returned to legality. In reality, the networks built during Prohibition simply moved into new revenue streams. Schultz mattered because he showed that the new system in New York still had limits. Even with Luciano's restructuring, the city could not be reduced to a perfectly stable map. Too much money flowed through too many hands. Too many men had private armies. Too many egos still believed they could rule alone. That is what makes the next phase so important. The challenge to New York's underworld would not come only from rival gangsters. It would come from the state itself in the form of a prosecutor who understood that one criminal case could destabilize an empire. Dutch Schultz was what happens when greed outruns discipline. By the mid-1930s, the underworld's center of gravity had shifted far beyond bootlegging. Harlem's numbers racket, gambling systems, labor influence, loans, and extortion networks all showed how deeply illegal enterprise had embedded itself in the city's daily life. The genius of organized crime was never only violence. It was penetration. It entered the routine habits of neighborhoods where people worked, what they gambled on, who loaned them money, who protected their business, who could make trouble disappear. Schultz fought for a greater share of these post-Prohibition streams because men like him understood that the city's vice markets were evolving. Whoever mastered them would remain powerful after the old bootlegging glamour faded. But the deeper organized crime entered daily economic life, the more it invited a different kind of threat. Not a rival with guns, a prosecutor with patience. Thomas Dewey mattered because he understood that gangster empires depended on the illusion of permanence. If the state could break that illusion, fear would spread through the machine. Dewey was ambitious, polished, relentless, and media-savvy. He did not look like the underworld, which made him more dangerous to it. He looked like order. He looked like legitimacy. He looked like the answer to a city tired of reading the same headlines. For Schultz, Dewey became an obsession. For Luciano, Dewey became a strategic threat. The prosecutor was not chasing random incidents anymore. He was moving toward systems. He was learning how vice, extortion, prostitution, gambling, and labor influence connected. That shift was critical. Gangsters survive when the law treats their crimes as isolated episodes. They become vulnerable when the law begins to see the network. By now, New York truly had two organized powers staring each other down. The criminal system had money, fear, political contamination, and long practice. The legal system had the state, publicity, courts, prisons, and a rising generation of prosecutors who had learned that organized crime could be attacked strategically. That confrontation gave the decade its tension. The Mafia was stronger than before, but so was the state's understanding of how to fight it. Schultz reacted with emotion. Luciano reacted with calculation, and that difference would decide who stayed alive. Thomas Dewey was not chasing one gangster. He was chasing a system. When Dutch Schultz began pushing the idea of killing Thomas Dewey, he crossed more than a legal line. He crossed a strategic line inside the underworld itself. Murdering a major public prosecutor was not simply another act of gangland violence. It risked inviting a level of state attention that could fall across everyone. The other bosses understood this. Criminal organizations can survive corruption, scandal, witnesses, and periodic arrests. What they fear is concentrated public fury backed by political consensus. Schultz, however, was increasingly driven by instinct and pressure that made him dangerous to his own allies. If he brought down extraordinary heat, then his private war with Dewey could become everyone's crisis. In systems like these, the moment a powerful man becomes too reckless, the question changes from how useful he is to how fast he must be removed. Schultz's murder in Newark was one of those moments where the criminal system revealed its own logic with brutal clarity. Outsiders could read it as revenge, chance, or internecine violence. Insiders understood it as a correction, A man too unstable to be managed had become a threat to the larger equilibrium, so he was eliminated. That is one of the coldest truths about organized crime. It does not reward loyalty in the sentimental sense. It rewards usefulness until usefulness becomes risk. The Palace Chop House killing signaled that the new order in New York would not tolerate chaos from inside any more than it tolerated rebellion from outside. Schultz was rich, feared, famous, and formidable. None of that saved him when his judgment threatened the broader interests of the syndicate. In that sense, his death was a lesson to every other ambitious gangster in the city. Power exists only as long as the machine still finds you profitable. Schultz's fall stripped away the glamour and left behind the mechanism. By the late 1930s, New York's underworld was no longer merely a collection of charismatic bosses. It was a self-correcting organism. It could authorize violence upward, sideways, or inward. It could sacrifice one of its own to preserve the larger body. That is why Luciano's redesign mattered so much. He had not eliminated brutality. He had helped make brutality functional. And still, the state kept advancing. Dewey did not disappear with Schultz. If anything, the death of one dangerous rival only narrowed his focus toward men whose power was deeper, more systematized, and more historically important. One of those men was Luciano himself. The Mafia could forgive brutality. It could forgive greed. It could not forgive stupidity that brought heat. If the Commission gave New York's Mafia a boardroom, Murder, Inc. gave it teeth. The label has passed into legend, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes stylized, but the underlying reality is chilling enough without decoration. Enforcement had become organized. Killings could be contracted, coordinated, and carried out with a level of efficiency that fit the new criminal age. The public saw isolated murders. The underworld knew there was an apparatus behind them. Louis Lept Buhalter stands at the center of that nightmare. So do other feared figures tied to the machinery of organized violence. What matters for your story is not only who killed whom. What matters is what this tells the viewer. New York's Mafia was no longer improvising punishment. It was institutionalizing it. Once violence becomes procedural, an empire can survive personalities much longer than before. Then came the blow against Luciano. Thomas Dewey and his team pursued the vice structure linked to prostitution and exploitation, building a case that finally dragged the architect of New York's criminal reorganization into the legal spotlight as a defendant rather than a strategist. In 1936, Luciano was convicted and sentenced heavily. For many observers, this looked like the great reversal. The man who had outmaneuvered bosses was now trapped by the state. But even this moment should be understood correctly. Luciano's conviction was not simply the fall of one criminal. It was proof that the legal system had begun to understand organized crime as structure. Dewey was not dismantling only a man. He was striking at the credibility of an entire underworld model. Still, prison walls do not instantly erase influence. Networks linger, loyalties persist, orders move through intermediaries. A king in prison can remain politically relevant if the system he built is strong enough. So by the end of the decade, New York's underworld stood in a tense balance. It had achieved unprecedented organization. It had survived internal war. It had removed reckless elements. It had built enforcement capacity. and yet it was bleeding under legal pressure. Lep would not escape forever. Murder, Inc. would become a national symbol of underworld horror. Luciano was in prison. The empire remained alive, but it no longer looked invincible. That is what makes the next turn so powerful. Organized crime is hardest to destroy when it begins to fracture from within. Prosecutors can raid. Judges can sentence. But when insiders start talking, the mythology begins to rot. The man who redesigned the Mafia could not redesign the courtroom. Empires rarely collapse from outside pressure alone. Usually, someone inside decides that survival is worth more than silence. Abe Reels became one of those men. His cooperation opened windows into killings that had lived in rumor and fear. Once insiders begin naming names, the underworld's greatest defense, uncertainty, starts to weaken. Murders become files. Legends become evidence. Whispered terror becomes testimony. That is why informants are so terrifying to organized crime. A raid can be survived. A newspaper scandal can be spun. Even a long sentence can be absorbed. But a witness who understands the machinery can force the state to see the whole design. Reels helped do that. Then, in one of the most infamous turns in underworld history, he died after falling from a hotel window while under police protection. Official explanations did little to quiet suspicion. To the public, it looked like another grim lesson in what this world could still reach. Then, Second World War changed the political atmosphere around the underworld in unexpected ways. The state that had imprisoned Luciano discovered that power can be useful even when it is criminal. Concerns over waterfront security, dock control, labor influence, sabotage fears, and wartime logistics created one of the strangest episodes in American underworld history. The government, in effect, found itself needing access to the very networks it had spent years trying to break. That wartime turn does not redeem Luciano. It reveals something darker and more realistic. States and criminal systems are not always pure enemies. Under pressure, they can become temporary users of one another's capabilities. That ambiguity belongs at the heart of your ending because it explains why New York's Mafia was never just a story about law versus lawlessness. It was a story about parallel power structures, sometimes colliding, sometimes contaminating each other. When Luciano was eventually deported, one chapter of the story closed, but the larger system did not vanish with him. That is the final truth your audience should leave with. Men died, bosses fell, prosecutors rose, witnesses talked. Some killers went to the chair, some were shot in restaurants. Some disappeared into prisons or foreign exile. But the system survived because it had become structural. It had embedded itself in labor, gambling, vice, enforcement, and urban habit. Luciano did not merely rise in that world. He helped redesign it so it could outlive him. And that is the real legacy of New York's Mafia between the 1920s and the 1940s. It was never only about murder. It was about governance without legitimacy. It was about a city so large, so hungry, so corruptible, and so modern that organized crime learned to behave like an alternative administration. One government wore badges, the other wore fedoras. One wrote laws, the other wrote consequences. For a generation, both ruled New York at the same time. Luciano left America. His blueprint did not.